Hi, welcome back to Module 4. We'll be discussing principles of organizing and systems-based organizing approach throughout Module 4. This will derive from components of Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 in your text. As we have been starting off each of our modules, let's define our terms. So organizing is defined as a management function that involves determining what tasks are to be done, who is to do them, how the tasks are to be grouped, who reports to whom, and where decisions are to be made. Organizational structure is key in any organization. It has basic functions, and those basic functions include that it produces organizational outputs. It regulates individual variations from organizational requirements. Additionally, it defines which positions will exercise power over other positions and how that power will be exercised. Organizational structure also enables a number of things. It systematically allocates diverse tasks. It helps create specified means of cooperation, among people and units. It helps establish channels of communication among people and units. Additionally, it allocates decision-making powers to people or positions that are most qualified to make those decisions. Organizational structure ultimately ensures that an organization will function properly. There are 5 classical principles of organizing: specialization, span of control, departmentalization, unity of command, and responsibility and authority. We will talk about each of these components over our next several slides. Our first principle of organizing is specialization. This is the individuals in an organization performing narrowly defined tasks. It ultimately contributes to efficiency. Our example is a worker on an assembly line. If we think about those assembly line workers adding to the components of a car, each individual performs a very specifically defined tasks. Our next principle of organizing is span of control. It's the number of people, units, or operations that a manager can effectively control. What determines this span of control? There are a couple of factors. First, it's the type of work done. It's the employee competence or expertise, as well as that supervisor competence and expertise. It's that relationship between supervisor and employee, and it's the pressure for production. I want us to think specifically about a football team. A football team is often considered to be a very specialized unit in that each person on a team does a specific task. I also then want us to think about the span of control across a football team. That is the number of people or units that a manager or coach can effectively control. And oftentimes, especially across the game of football, there are position coaches. That is, a coach is devoted to each position. That span of control then would be based upon the position. I hope that gives us a little bit of example for both specialization and span of control. This slide offers a visual representation of span of control. We can think about flat structures versus tall structures. I tried to give the example in the previous slide about football coaches. That would be that tall structure, or football teams I rather should say, where there are many coaches that make their way down across positions and ultimately make their way into individual team members. That goes from top to bottom. It's quite tall from the person at the top to the person at the bottom. A flat structure would be a much shorter line. That is, there is one person overseeing the employees, or maybe 2 people, or a 2 level. Most larger organizations will have those tall structures, and some of our smaller organizations will have flatter structures. I also want us to recognize that even within individual organizations, there may be components that are flat and components that are tall. In regard to our classical principles of organizing, we've talked about specialization and span of control. We're now going to move on to talk about our third component, departmentalization, and our fourth component, unity of command. So what is departmentalization? As organizational activities grow and become more complex, they need to be grouped into those homogeneous sets. Some of those departments can become a process or function oriented. They also can be product or goal oriented, or they can be a matrix, the combination of both. Our next component or principle of organizing is unity of command. This is our fourth notion. Each member of the organization should follow the orders of and be accountable to only one supervisor. This helps ensure that the organization has a clear directive from those in charge. Our fifth and final principle of organizing is responsibility and authority. Employees must have the necessary authority to carry out assigned responsibilities. That is, if an employee doesn't feel as if they have that authority, they won't then carry out the necessary responsibilities. Just as a sum up, make sure we recognize that there are 5 principles of organizing: specialization, span of control, departmentalization, unity of command, and responsibility and authority. When talking about any organizational structure, as well as those classical principles of organizing, bureaucracy must also be discussed. There are 5 tenets of bureaucracy I want to hit on. We can think about this in division of labor into simple, well-defined tasks. There's also this consideration of hierarchical authority or structure. There's a systems of rules. Bureaucracy is often known to be impersonal. And finally, there's also a technical competence. There are a number of criticisms of bureaucracy, and we'll talk about those in just a second. Bureaucracy has a number of criticisms. It tends that the more bureaucratic an organization is, the more that the jobs become monotonous, routine, and potentially degrading. In addition, with increased bureaucracy comes an interdepartmental rivalry. There's also often communication breakdown. Rules may be considered outdated and rigid. Bureaucracy is more concerned with rules and less concerned with personal feelings. And with that, then, a bureaucratic organization often promotes based on seniority rather than competence. These are just some common criticism for bureaucracy. It could be argued that the opposite of democracy is bureaucracy, or vice versa. So, what does democracy do, especially within an organization? It identifies commonly agreed upon goals and permits debate and dissent. It allows employees freedom. Bureaucracy, though, achieves specified goals, and it often emphasizes adherence to rules and procedures. Bureaucracy and democracy seem to be at odds with each other. This is an interesting component when trying to determine what is most effective and maybe even what is most efficient for the organization of your company. I really like how this slide examines and breaks down democracy versus bureaucracy based upon purpose, concern, and process. Please note that the purpose of democracy is often to identify majority goals, and a bureaucracy is concerned with achieving majority goals. A concern of democracy is informed opinions, those especially of the organizational members. Bureaucratic concern is with efficiency. Democratic processes are concerned with the freedom of expression. Those can be done through discussion and even dissent. Bureaucratic processes are concerned with disciplined obedience of an organization. They ask for compliance to procedures and authority. It should be important to recognize that maybe in some instances or some procedures that bureaucracy is required. In other instances, organizations may be able to employ a democratic perspective. Our last concept under these basic principles of organizing is organizational design. This is the process of creating or changing the organizational structure. When designing or even redesigning an organization, managers need to consider the classical principles of organizing. In addition, it's important to consider those bureaucratic as well as democratic components we've just determined. It could make sense that, as we've seen historically in the past, companies are transitioning from more of that bureaucratic to more of a democratic approach. That may be a more common organizational design we see today. We are now going to transition from talking about those basic principles of organizing to now talking about our systems-based organizing approach. So what is a systems-based organizing approach? It's viewing an organization as a system interacting with its environment. The emphasis is on environmental influence. It's awareness of the stakeholders' needs, it's monitoring similar organizations, as well as a willingness to change the way an organization does business if and when societal changes its standards. We are now going to move forward to explore 3 theories for designing organizations, kind of based upon this systems-based organization approach. These 3 theories are sensitive to the environment and form the basis for these design approaches. We will talk about the Lorsch and Lorsch model, the Thompson model, as well as the Parsons model. Let's first think about and address the Lorsch and Lorsch model. This model is based upon or thinks about subsystems. It considers that there are 3 subsystems differ with respect to 3 elements. Those are the rate at which respective sub-environments change, the relative amounts of information they have about their environments, and the feedback they receive from the environment. In addition, these elements constitute what Lorsch and Lorsch call the certainty of the environment. Furthermore, the relative certainty of the environment faced by the subsystems creates 2 specific problems for the organizations. That is, where differentiation and integration come into play. Differentiation occurs when an organization is divided into units according to environmental exigencies, and those units are then staffed with people of the appropriate aptitude and skills. Differentiation, according to Lorsch and Lorsch, is this division of labor based on differing environmental conditions. Furthermore, Lorsch and Lorsch recognize that integrating the subunits into a meaning and effective whole is often a problem. So how does this apply to sport managers? That'll come next. As we are thinking about an appropriate way to design the structure of our organization, how would the Lorsch and Lorsch model apply for sport managers? This example shows us that subunits concerned with the production of the sport, say teams, coaches, and on this instance, our example, athletic trainer, will be structured differently than those that are marketing or facility management subunits. That is because those that are involved with the team, i.e. coaches and athletic training, deal with different environmental factors, than those regarding marketing or facility management. Let's consider the Thompson model next. This model considers boundary spanning units. That is, they have direct contact with the external environment and they provide environmental stability. There's also the technical core. This is most directly concerned with production of goods or services. The Thompson model states that organizations should attempt to seal off the technical core from uncertainties, those uncertainties most displayed in the environment. Why? Because the technical core is that which is responsible or most directly concerned with the production of the good or service. How can we apply this? Let's look. How does this apply for sport managers? This visual gives us a representation of that. This offers the idea that athletic teams and coaches are the technical core and therefore should be insulated from outside distractions, those being University Board of Governors, our athletic department, and the like. This can also be applied to other key executives or those responsible for the technical core. The Thompson model again believes that those should be insulated from outside distractions. Our third and final theory for designing organizations is the Parsons model. This is relevant for organizations that have elected and appointed bodies of administrators. It considers those hierarchical sub-organizations with a technical subsystem, a managerial subsystem, as well as an institutional subsystem. It makes sense to recognize that the Parsons model may be used for those nonprofit organizations or maybe even government-run organizations. Here is our application point or our implication point for sport managers based upon the Parsons model. The technical subsystem, which is the coaches, assistants, and athletes we've been talking about, should be allowed to carry out activities without undue influence from the managerial subsystem or even the institutional subsystem. That's displayed in our visual here. In differentiated organizations, a traditional authority structure may not always work. Those conventional or bureaucratic notions may not work in this differentiated organization. There are other forms of authority structure, though, that might be more appropriate. One is the flexiform model and also a soft bureaucracy model. We'll talk about those in the next couple of slides. Those organizations that have unique properties of both professional and human services organizations can be better served with an organizational structure, for example, a flexiform. This proposed structure considers operational units and administrative core as loosely coupled with one another. These operational units need to basically be self-contained. They're relatively autonomous units and essentially operate as mini companies. There's also a basic distinction between power and authority. Authority relates to the decisions that affect all units or most of them, and this typically resides in that administrative core. Functional power, on the other hand, relates to what happens within individual units, and it stems from the expertise residing in the units. In this model, functional power is greatest at the operational unit level. It decreases as it moves towards the administrative core at the center. Again, we recognize that a flexiform is not a traditional organizational model, but it offers that flexibility, pun intended, for organizations that don't fit a traditional mold. Flexiform has in some way morphed into this concept of soft bureaucracy. This is where operational units are working on new technologies and innovation. This notion considers that bureaucratic rules of what should be done, who should do it, and how it should be done may not be meaningful in all instances. In essence, then, these operational units are free to take actions they deem fit, but they are still answerable to the larger unit, for their actions. In keeping up with current technology and such, theoretical and practical approaches to structuring an organization emphasize turbulence posed by these technological advances in production and communication, as well as the impact for globalization. In order to interact effectively with these ever-changing environments, some innovative organizations have attended to adopt forms of structuring that are loosely labeled network organizations. And within those network organizations, we see internal networks, external networks, and internal organizational networks. Let's talk about these. Internal network involves individuals within the organization interacting with each other to solve problems or to innovate new methods and techniques. Our example for internal networks for work processes is a consideration of a multi-use facility. Say, for example, a gymnasium that ultimately houses both volleyball and basketball. This internal network indicates that instead of always going to a manager and a manager then going to the next person, the ability to communicate and network within the network helps then. Internal networks involve individuals within the organizations interacting with each other to solve problems or to innovate new methods and techniques. This example for internal networks is a consideration for work processes. This example demonstrates that if an organization has a multi-use facility, say that volleyball and basketball both participate in this facility, that there are continual ways that within the organization that the volleyball players can interact, the volleyball coach can interact with, say, the basketball coach and ultimately first aid and electrical, as well as the facility, rather than always having to go through a frontline manager. This innovation or network ultimately allows the facilities to more smoothly and speedily operate. Our next example of internal networks dealing with external events. Let's say, for example, that a riot breaks out after a football game. The units within the university in charge of various things such as security, traffic, fire prevention, and so on, as well as those emergency units, would interact with each other to control the riot. If necessary, these units would be empowered to interact with external agencies such as the city police and fire department. The whole idea here is that the units interact with each other directly instead of going through a governor or board of directors. Because of the nature of this event, it's important then that these internal networks can deal with each other individually rather than having to go through, again, that outside person. First, let's define external network. An external network involves one or more internal units interacting with units external to the organization. Our example here is of external networks facilitating internal processes. Say, for example, an event management unit wants to put on a local 5K. In this event planning, that event management unit would need to be permitted to contact the local police department in order to make traffic and security arrangements for the 5K. The units within the sport management, event management would have the liberty to do so. That is an example of our external network facilitating internal processes. Another type of external network is determined or formed when an organization decides to let another organization take on production or marketing functions. That is, they outsource those. Our example here demonstrates that the football club considers outsourcing their stadium, their event management, their team management, their ticketing, their marketing, as well as their facility management. Our third and final type of network organizations are inter-organizational networks. These allow member organizations to have greater access to resources. They also increase financial performance. They facilitate innovation and sharing of knowledge. It reduces variety and uncertainty in transactions. It coordinates activities among member institutions. Our greatest example we see of this in the U.S. is the NCAA. Our example here is the NCAA as an inter-organizational network. Not only does the NCAA interact with each of the individual universities listed here, but the universities in and of themselves interact with each other. We have reached the end of Module 4. We have spent a good amount of time discussing the principles of organizing. Furthermore, we've gone through and talked about basic organizational structure, as well as our classic principles of organizing. We've delved in a little deeper to consider those. We've also looked at the systems-based organizing approach, and we've considered environmental factors. We've gone on also to consider a number of theories in examining organizational structure. I've included here 3 questions for review. Use these questions to help guide your learning and check your understanding.